So I just wanted to finish up with a discussion of the last few chapters of John Locke's The Second Treatise of Government, starting with chapter 19, which is of the dissolution of government. He says at the beginning that anybody that wants to truly understand ought to distinguish between the dissolution of society and the dissolution of the government. One is way worse than the other. And his point will be that if you get to the point where society is dissolved, where there's no coherent social organization, then things are pretty bad indeed. So you want to basically prevent that from happening by hopefully anticipating the need for change and encompassing it within your existing political structure so that you don't have a breakdown of the political situation. In other words, it's one thing to change the government, and it's another thing to change society. You can change, for instance, who's king, and you keep your government and the structure of governance intact. It's another thing to have a meltdown in which you have a civil war or social strife, and then you no longer have civil society, and then it's much more difficult to recuperate from that and come back to some sort of civil order. Ideally, you don't want a dissolution of government, because not long after dissolution of government, you may have dissolution of society. So he goes through the various ways in which government can be dissolved. And of course, one of the most important ways is from without, that is, from external assault or attack. But to a certain extent, you can't control that. So he turns quickly to the things that can lead to this dissolution of government from within. And the first is when the legislature is altered. So if the legislature is dissolved, for instance, by the king or by the executive, this is very dangerous because the legislative power is literally the foundation of all political power, according to Locke. Or if the legislative power is broken because it is divided and in civil disorder amongst the various members, as happened during the English Civil Wars, this is also very dangerous. There is no way for the people to act coherently if the legislative power is divided or under assault. If the people can't act coherently, this is when you would have a devolution into civil strife and then social chaos. So, of course, a major threat to legislative power is a king who basically declares himself to be the law and decides that he doesn't need a legislature, or will call it at his pleasure and pretty much doesn't want to hear from the legislature. Or if the king makes some sort of deal with a foreign power that isn't approved of by the legislature, that changes basically what the nation is, again, the king has basically usurped the power of the legislative branch and, again, has, in essence, assaulted the popular power that is the origin of government. The executive can also basically abandon his post or refuse to carry out the laws of the legislature. In this case, there's a disconnect between the laws and the execution, and again, the acts of the executive have led to a sort of nullification of the people's power. So Locke says, in these and the like cases, when the government is dissolved, the people are at liberty to provide for themselves by erecting a new legislative, differing from the other by the change of persons or form, or both, as they shall find it most for their safety and good. For the society can never by the default of another lose the native and original right it has to preserve itself, which can only be done by a settled legislative and a fair and impartial execution of the laws made by it. Well, that sounds nice, but actually it's very scary, and Locke knows it. When you get to the point where the government is dissolved because it's ineffectual or because it doesn't represent the will of the people to the extent that they will actually try to revolt against it, then you have a situation of relative chaos. And Locke does not desire this outcome. And that becomes clear here. He's cautioning, in effect, that especially the executive not let things come to such a pass that the people feel the need to revolt and bring about this dissolution of government. But we don't want to get to a place where relief is too late, as he says, and the evil is past cure. And this is really his point, is that we need to see the problems coming before they get to this pass. There is a sort of built-in prejudice in society in favor of social order. And so Locke makes it clear that it will take an awful lot of mismanagement and malfeasance on the part of government in order for people to get to the point where they will actually try to dissolve it and start over again. And it gives the government plenty of time to reform itself prior to that. And this seems to be what he's urging here. Again, he says, if a long train of abuses, prevarications, and artifices, all tending the same way, make the design visible to the people, and they cannot but feel what they lie under, and see whither they are going, it is not to be wondered that they should then rouse themselves and endeavor to put the rule into such hands which may secure to them the ends for which government was at first erected. So that reference again to the long train of abuses necessary. People are very patient. They're afraid of change. There's a natural instinct to avoid it. There is a point, though, where people will revolt, and Locke is very much cautioning, do not push people to that extent. In fact, Locke says that his doctrine is the best fence against rebellion, because if the authorities understand it well enough, they will know, basically, that they need to shape up and reform themselves before the people take this power back into their own hands, leaving everybody exposed to the risks involved with rebellion. Chapter 19 is a very long chapter. So after he gets done with that commentary, which cautions people in government to take seriously the power of the people and make reforms ahead of time, he turns to the issue of, frankly, regicide, meaning again, which he's touched upon before, but the question of when it is justifiable to kill a king. Again, he tries to deal with the issue of, given the fact that there's this reverence for the monarch, is it ever permissible to capture and kill the king? And we've already covered this, so I won't belabor it, but it is here where he uses the term, a king may unking himself. That is, if he does not act according to the well-being of the people, he is no legitimate king, and therefore he does not have this sacred aura that would prevent people from doing violence to him. It's a very democratic sentiment, really. There is no sacredness other than what the people give, and they only give that that title of sacred, if they do at all, to leaders who reflect their wishes and who take care of their common good. This is all designed to break down this psychological resistance, this long ingrained tendency to reverence and a sense that the king and the people around him are naturally superior to the rest of the people, and that one ought to tread very cautiously and and respectfully around them. Locke says, "Here it is like the common question will be made, who shall be judge whether the prince or legislative act contrary to their trust? To this I reply, the people shall be judge. For who shall be judge whether his trustee or deputy acts well and according to the trust reposed in him, but he who deputes him, and must, by having deputed him, have still a power to discard him when he fails in his trust?" In other words, the people deputize their leaders. They are the source of the power, and so they are the judge ultimately. Then God comes up as far as judges go. And this language that Locke uses can be kind of tricky. He says, "But farther, this question cannot mean that there is no judge at all, for where there is no judicature on earth to decide controversies among men, God in heaven is judge. He alone, it is true, is judge of the right, but every man is judge for himself, as in all other cases, so in this, whether another hath put himself into a state of war with him." So he both kind of validates the idea that God in heaven is the judge, but yet also at the same time, every man is judge for himself in all other cases, and in this, which is the the case at hand of judging government. He is the one who will judge whether another, such as the king, has put himself into a state of war with him. So that doesn't make it really clear where God's authority ends and man's authority begins. And Locke often seems to refer to God and the supreme judge, as he calls him, or heaven, God's realm, in a fairly abstract way. As I mentioned before, appealing to heaven seems very much to mean simply rolling the dice in a revolution to Locke. He uses the term again here in this chapter when he says, "The appeal then lies nowhere but to heaven. Force between either persons who have no superior on earth, or which permits no appeal to a judge on earth, being properly a state of war, wherein the appeal lies only to heaven, and in that state the injured party must judge for himself when he will think fit to make use of that appeal and put himself upon it." Again, there's a mixing here of the authority of God and the authority of man. There's a sort of ambiguous statement. What does it mean to appeal to heaven when there is no judge on earth? Well, we know it means, partly at least, going ahead and taking direct action through rebellion, and the assumption being that whoever is the victor, heaven approves of. And that's about as far as we get with God's authority here. So it's ambiguous, it's abstract. There's an awful lot of empowering of human agency here, of human decisions, in this case of whether to judge the government unjust and whether to rebel against it. So that's the last chapter in the book. It's very long and it ends the book. And so I just want to highlight a few points before I go. The first is that Locke and God may be on speaking terms, but not in any sort of traditional sense. Locke is very much an enlightenment thinker when it comes to God. God and nature function for Locke as one for the most part. In other words, God is what is given in the world. Locke's God is the God of reason and nature. And yes, he does quote scripture, but if you take a look at what he says and how he uses the concept of God, it's mainly in the sense of a supreme authority which goes along with human reason as he defines it. So there is a tension in Locke between the enlightenment God, or maybe even you would say human reason, and the biblical God of Revelation. And this is a tension that's obscured by those who think of Locke as a sort of wholesome prop for a Christianized notion of the American founding. One of the peculiar and either glorious or scary aspects of the American founding, depending on how you reason about it, is that many of the founders were rationalists and deists, much like Locke appears to be, even though he does quote and cite scripture. There's definitely tension there, just as there were in many of the founding fathers and from the American Revolution. And we see that very clearly because Locke wants to get rid of any notion of divine right of kings. He wants to get rid of any notion of sacredness being associated with public power. So anyway, that's one thing to note. It is far from simple to say what relationship Locke's thought has to traditional Christianity. Another thing to note is Locke's preoccupation with property in the sense of property rights. Locke defines us very much according to property. Human beings have property in themselves, in their body, and actually the origin of property is the mixture of that primary property of our body with the things of the earth, which creates more property. And then why is government created? Largely because human beings find a way to extend their property through the use of money beyond what they can control with their own individual efforts, which leads to the need for government protection and enforcement of agreements amongst people, and also just property protection. And even though capitalism was a thing in the future at this point when Locke was writing, there's a sort of nascent capitalism going on, the beginnings of capitalist thought here, in this notion that property is what we seek, property is what defines us, and this has ramifications for our mentality that might first escape notice because we swim in that water, but even though some of Locke's notions about property seem very common sense, to think of ourselves and our body primarily as our property can lead to some excesses, like legalism, for instance, looking at all human relationships from the point of view of legality, of treating children like they're our private property, for instance, in divorce settlements, of an obsession with the inviolability of our bodies, as in the case of a woman's sort of absolute right at this point to determine what she will do with the child in her womb, excluding the father's rights over the matter, leading to also materialism generally, the idea that pretty much we can boil all things down to property and property rights, and that in effect the pursuit of happiness can be defined as the pursuit of property, and of course that has ramifications for our characters. Capitalism has worked pretty well as far as raising our standard of living, although unequally, but still overall it's been quite a boon materialistically for human beings, but at the same time it has also led to, one could argue, a sort of diminishment of human character and spirit, a circumscribing or a corralling of the human spirit into these bounds, so that anything outside of the material universe as it is defined before us in our economy, is really kind of unknown or discounted. So materialism is a legacy of this general way of thinking, and it has both good and bad consequences. Also, this is the origin of male and female equality and of the notion of human equality more generally. Again, in some ways, this has been a very good thing, and I would not like to refute all notions of male-female equality, but the liberal theme of equality erases differences, and sometimes those differences can be pretty important, and one could make the argument that in erasing differences or causing us not to see those differences, we abstract from the reality of people's identity in a way that people do feel and do chafe against. So we're still struggling with the whole, what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? Is there any difference? If there is a difference other than the physiological, what difference does it make, etc. These types of questions arise because of the legacy of Lockean and other sources of liberalism. And maybe most importantly, there is in Lockean liberalism a rejection of the more expansive view of virtue that was held by the ancient philosophers and also the medieval Christian philosophers in Europe, in which virtue meant moral virtue and a particular kind of character. And in these earlier points of view, government was instituted largely to shape human character in a particular direction towards some definition of moral virtue, whether it was, the life of the wise citizen or the life of the brave warrior or whatever the social ideal might be. But in the new way of thinking, represented by Lockean liberalism, government steps out of the business of defining what is virtuous and how one ought to live one's life, and allows the individual to pursue that question for him or herself. Furthermore, the virtues that tend to be shaped in a liberal system are what we come to call bourgeois virtues, virtues that are conditioned by the needs of commercial activity. The economy comes to be the structure that dictates and shapes people's character. It is no longer the focus of governmental authority or even of societal conversation, but rather it's the needs of the various enterprises competing in a capitalist economy that define what types of characters are good, namely good for economic growth and well-being. So virtues change from, let's say, the high virtues of wisdom and courage and piety and holiness, in other words, and things like that, to the virtues of hard work and truth-telling and cleanliness and politeness and all of those attributes that make for good business. Arguably, we have gained much, but also we have lost much. And I think that it's important for us to understand that this turn towards liberalism was not an unmixed and unmitigated good, that there has been harm, and one might even argue some great harm involved in this, and that it has led to a truncated type of human being, that there may be more, in fact there is more, to a human being than the liberal system wants to acknowledge and shape. Anyway, I said at the beginning that I would bring in some of the intellectual influences that have had an impact on me, and so that's why you have this conclusion. I hope this will inspire you to go and read Locke's Second Treatise of Government yourself, so that you can think about it for yourself, and come up with your own ideas of what Locke means and what you think about it. All right. It's been good doing this, and I'm looking forward to what comes next.